Welcome to the Paraeducator Training course, week 10, module 10, day 2. Continuing our discussion of early childhood development today, and we're going to be focusing on language. This is my favorite topic. All right. The development of language and literacy is all about how we communicate. We often think about language as being what we hear or what we say, how we speak, but language actually involves a lot more than that. It includes our spoken and written communication along with our facial expressions, voice tones, and body gestures. So what we're talking about here are extralinguistic actions that contribute to communication. Communication takes on new importance when children enter preschool. Why? Because language becomes the primary tool for establishing and maintaining relationships with adults and other children. Language development is closely related to cognitive development, since the words these young students use are representing objects and ideas. So both tangible things and abstractions are covered by language. Language is a tool that we use to describe everything in our universe. The richer and fuller a child's vocabulary is, the more likely the child will become a good reader. So we want to communicate with them using a wide variety of vocabulary, and we want to explain the meaning of words they don't understand. This doesn't mean that we're doing everything for them or we're doing their thinking for them. It simply means that we are giving them a scaffold they need to learn the meaning of the word so that they can use it themselves the next time they encounter it. All right, two types of speech we're talking about, receptive and expressive. Receptive speech refers to the language that we take in or receive and understand. So reception is what I would call it. And expressive speech refers to the language that we are able to give or express to someone else. And I would call this production. So it's the dichotomy between reception and production. Giving children opportunities to have conversations allows them to practice both their reception and production. It also allows them to work on taking turns, listening, and talking. We have to be socialized to learn how to take conversational turns, right? And this is an indicator, when a young person is learning to take those turns, it's an indicator of expected cognitive development. In other words, non-exceptional. Young children come to be able to listen carefully for different purposes, right? We've all seen teachers say things like, now listen carefully for the vowels, or listen carefully for the words about colors. Children should be able to follow and give simple directions, to ask and answer questions. We know they can ask questions, but here's where they come to be able to answer more questions than before. People become able to use appropriate volume and speed when they talk. That's another part of language socialization. And to participate in discussions and use the rules of conversation. Children also should be able to use language to express their thoughts and emotions. Okay, so we're talking about preschool, kindergarten here. It's important to be sensitive to young children's efforts in learning a new language. It can be uncomfortable or even frightening for a child to be surrounded by people and sounds that they're not used to hearing. So we want to give them that support and that scaffolding that they may need in order to build confidence. So we usually talk about that in terms of learning a second language. And it's true, a lot of our students are second language English speakers, what you would say in shorthand as L2 English speakers. But it's also true of the L1, the first language. We need to have the confidence to take risks in our first language and produce original sentences. So for that reason, we want to support young learners stretching out with their language, even if what we get sometimes is really pretty funny constructions, comical constructions. Using gestures, we're talking about the extra linguistic aspects of communication, things outside of words. Using gestures and simple 1 to 2 word sentences in the beginning will help children meet their basic needs, get their basic needs met, I should have written, while adapting to the new sounds around them. Okay, so here's a phone. Phone call, phone call, phone call, right? 2 words talking about something that you do with the phone. It's important that children who speak another language other than English continue to speak their native language in their homes. Okay. It's no secret that I have a strong opinion about this. I strongly agree with this statement. There are a whole bunch of reasons, but you don't have to believe me. You can believe the research that shows that children who are bilingual or multilingual are more successful writers in English later on in life. Language is really an important part of culture. There are words in any given language that cannot be translated into English. I can think of a number of words in some other languages where there's no ready translation in English, or you'd have to use 50 words to describe the same thing that you get with 2 words in another language. So the point is, we don't want to erase or efface a heritage language that someone may speak, because it cuts them off from aspects of their culture that they will not have access to without the language. So if a child doesn't retain their native language, some of their culture can literally be lost to them. All right, reception versus production again. Children will be able to understand the language much sooner than they will be able to speak it. Yeah. So their reception develops much faster than their production does. Getting your mouth to make sounds, the human capacity for language, everything that we use to make language only does so secondarily, right? Your lips are not just for talking, your tongue is not just for talking, your teeth are not just for talking, right? They all form, your nose, they all have primary functions. Their secondary function is language. So when we are young people and we're developing, that body is trying to make sure that all of those things function. Can you breathe with your mouth closed? Can you eat food, right? Can you taste food? All that kind of stuff. So that's what happens right away. And more slowly is the learning of how to coordinate all of these articulators, we call them, to make language. It's a long process. Children first have to have that receptive development where they figure out, they decide, okay, this sound is language and this sound is non-linguistic noise. And so once they start to be able to discriminate between the two, that's when they start to assemble what's called a phoneme inventory of a language. They decide what are all the allowable sounds of human language. That's an oversimplification of it. But I'm sure anyone watching this can see that if a person is exposed to more than one language at a very early age, then they will be less discriminatory in the future. They will accept more sounds automatically as being linguistic sounds and fewer sounds as being non-linguistic sounds. So by extension, by metaphoric extension, we can see that this can move into other areas in a person's life, therefore making them less discriminatory less discriminatory adults. Some children will learn faster than others. We know that people learn at different rates and feel more comfortable speaking, while others may wait for a long period of time before ever attempting to speak. All right, let's talk about supporting ELLs, English language learners, in the classroom. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, an average of 9% of students in US public schools are ELLs. That number is closer to 14% in cities. Okay, so when we include the rural and the urban, it's about 9, but in cities, more like 14. Okay, what follow are 5 ways to support ELLs in class. The first one is to make things visual. We remember that people learn things different ways. They're visual learners, kinesthetic learners, etc. When giving instructions, even basic directions for classroom procedures should be written on the board, right? We call this being represented with graphemes. You know, so letters, characters, all these kinds of things, they're all called graphemes. And you know what? That's ding, ding, ding. That's our college word of the day. Let's talk about it. Graphemes. Okay, so any human writing system is composed of graphemes. And they generally have only an abstract relation to the sound that they're intended to represent. Sometimes there is a sort of one-to-one relationship between a grapheme and what it's meant to represent. There's a grapheme that looks a little bit like this in Chinese and some other Asian languages, and it means mouth. And you can see that it looks like a little mouth. There's another one that, I'm doing this wrong, but it's another one that looks kind of like this, and it means middle. And you can see, yeah, it looks like a picture of the middle of something. But most graphemes have, and these are just the simplest, the very, very simplest of Chinese characters. Most graphemes have very little relation to the thing that they're representing in terms of how they look. And no grapheme has a direct relationship to how they are pronounced. Maybe Korean. There are some, there's some shapes in Korean that are helpful. But in general, graphemes are just things that we make up. And what we are claiming here in this slide is that the inclusion of graphemes helps visual learners. Challenging concepts should be diagrammed or supported with pictures. Okay. Also, demonstrating or modeling processes that you want the students to reproduce can be really helpful. And this includes the non-linguistic, right? I take my scissors and I go like this, not like this, right? Okay, supporting ELLs, way number 2, include more group work. You know, obviously this leads to more socialization and more language socialization. More engagement leads to more learning. That means less teacher-led whole class instruction, more small groups where students can practice language with their peers in a more personal, lower risk setting. Okay, all language use involves risk. People fear the risk of being judged by others, even in their first language, right? Oh, is the language I'm using today appropriate for this venue? You know, am I talking like I'm in a bar when really I'm in a classroom, or the opposite? You know, but you know, when you're young, speaking at class level, like when the teacher is calling on you and you have to answer a question, that can be a very anxiety-prone pursuit. So in a smaller group setting, this removes some of that worry, some of that potential for risk. All right, way number 3. If ELLs are part of your classroom, and I guarantee they are, there will be an ESL teacher at the school, or maybe several, but we want to be in communication with our own students in our classroom, our own students' ESL teacher. There are a lot of reasons for this. One of them is that coordinating lessons helps to build vocabulary. So if, you know, in a general classroom, you're going to learn 5 or 6 subjects in a day, even at the 1st and 2nd grade level, right? So included in that is probably science. Science will be one of them. If the class is learning about trees, the ESL teacher should be able to instruct some amount of plant vocabulary. That's what we call, that's another instance of scaffolding, where we're giving the learners the vocabulary that they need in order to be independent. All right, way number 4. Honor the silent period. This is something that's difficult for a lot of educators to do. Some ELLs go through a time when they will not take the risk of speaking. They do need to eventually take these risks, but they shouldn't be forced to. When I look at this picture of this little girl, she just looks like a perfect example of that. She looks like her eyes seem to say that she's gathering a lot of data from the students around her, but she's not quite ready to take those data and formulate them into her own, you know, her own production yet. She's working on her reception. Okay, way number 5. Allow some scaffolding with the first language. Okay, this goes back to the point I made earlier. It's short-sighted to disallow a student's first language entirely, to disallow the L1. You know, more than that, it's not supported by research. Allowing the L1 to be used is an inclusive practice that can lead to faster L2 uptake. And there is a ton of research that supports that. So don't believe me, you can go look it up on Google Scholar. All right, that brings us to the end of Module 10, Day 2. Thank you for staying with me until the end here. And we'll be back to talk about supporting deaf and hard of hearing learners in the next lecture. Thanks.